Hello and welcome back to Restful Nightmare. I'm so glad you could join me for another story tonight. Before we dive in, let me know where you're listening from. I'd love to hear your thoughts. If you're enjoying the stories, don't forget to subscribe, and as always, feel free to leave a comment below. Your feedback helps me create even more chilling tales for you. Tonight's story is a journey into the eerie unknown, so sit back, relax, and let's begin. It was one of those nights when the moon hung heavy in the sky, casting a silver glow over everything it touched. The world seemed at peace, as though nothing could disturb the calm that had settled over the small town. I was just finishing up my usual evening routine, unwinding after a long day. The kitchen lights flickered softly as I wiped down the counter, the familiar scent of lemon-scented cleaner mingling with the faint aroma of the dinner I'd just eaten. Everything was as it should be. The house was quiet, save for the occasional creak of the wooden floorboards under my feet, a sound I'd grown used to over the years. I lived alone in this small two-story home on the outskirts of town. It was a place I found comfort in, even when the night air carried an unsettling chill. I leaned against the kitchen counter, my hands wrapped around a cup of hot tea, letting the warmth seep into my palms. It had been a peaceful day, one of those rare days when everything seemed to align just right. I could hear the hum of the refrigerator in the background, the soft rustle of the leaves outside, and the occasional distant bark of a dog from the neighborhood. The kind of sounds that made the world feel normal. But something was off tonight. I couldn't put my finger on it, but a subtle unease had settled in the pit of my stomach. I brushed it off at first, attributing it to the late hour and the weariness that came with a long day, but the feeling didn't go away. It lingered, creeping into my thoughts like an unwanted guest. It wasn't until I made my way toward the front door to lock it for the night that I noticed it. The lock was different. I could have sworn I'd locked it earlier in the evening, but now it was slightly ajar. Just enough for me to notice, just enough to make my heart skip a beat. I paused, my hand hovering over the door handle. My pulse quickened and I felt a strange shiver crawl down my spine. It was probably nothing, I reasoned. Maybe I hadn't turned the lock all the way. I gave a small nervous laugh to myself, brushing off the discomfort. I stepped forward, closing the door and securing the lock with a firm twist. But even as I did, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. It was the smallest of details, too small to make sense of, yet it lingered in my mind. I glanced around the living room, my eyes scanning the space. Everything seemed normal. The couch cushions were fluffed, just like I left them. The TV remote sat untouched on the coffee table. It was all so normal. But the unease remained. With a deep breath, I decided to turn in for the night. I made my way upstairs, the familiar creaks of the stairs beneath my feet offering some comfort. I could feel the weight of the day settling into my bones, and I longed for the escape of sleep. As I reached the top of the stairs, a sound caught my attention. A soft, almost imperceptible scrape. It came from the hallway, just outside my bedroom door. My heart thudded in my chest. I froze for a moment, listening intently. There it was again, a faint scrape, like something, or someone, was dragging something heavy across the floor. I swallowed hard, my mind racing. It couldn't be. The house was empty. I was alone. I slowly turned toward the hallway, the shadows of the night swallowing up the space beyond. My pulse hammered in my ears, and I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. I told myself it was just my imagination, that it was nothing. But deep down, I knew something had changed. Something was wrong. The night had settled in deeper now, a cold and uninviting blanket over the small neighborhood. With the pizza boxes stacked neatly in the back seat, I drove through the empty streets, the faint hum of the car engine the only sound accompanying me. The city had fallen into a strange, almost unnatural quiet, the kind that makes you feel as though the world is holding its breath. I reached the first house on my delivery list, a place I had been to countless times before. It was a modest two-story home with a faded porch light that flickered every now and then. The front yard was neatly kept, with a few dried leaves scattered across the ground, remnants of the fall season. As I approached the front door, I noticed something odd. The house, despite its normal exterior, seemed off. There was no movement inside, no sign of life at all. The usual sounds of television or music, which I often heard from this particular home, were missing. It was as though the house itself had gone still, frozen in time. I rang the doorbell. No answer. I rang it again, this time a little more insistently. The faint sound of footsteps echoed from within, slow and deliberate. A moment later, the door creaked open, revealing the figure of a man, but not one I recognized. He was older, with a scruffy beard and eyes that looked far too tired for someone of his age. His clothes were worn, and there was a strange, unsettling look about him, as if he had been expecting me for far longer than I had been standing at his door. "Delivery for you," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, despite the unease creeping up my spine. The man didn't respond immediately. Instead, he stared at me, his gaze intense, almost searching. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was seeing something in me that I couldn't quite understand. Finally, he nodded and reached for the pizza. "Come in," he muttered, his voice low and rasping. "It's been a long time since anyone's brought food here." I hesitated, but something in his voice, the heaviness of it, made me take a step forward. Maybe it was the way his eyes seemed to hold a strange, pleading sadness, or maybe it was the growing sense of discomfort that I couldn't quite place. Either way, I crossed the threshold, stepping into the dimly lit hallway. The air inside was thick with the smell of stale cigarettes and something else, something musty, like old wood left too long in the damp. The walls were lined with photographs, but they weren't the kind of family photos you'd expect. No, these were strange, old black and white images of people I didn't recognize, some of them blurred, others too still. They all seemed to stare at me with an unsettling intensity, their faces locked in expressions that were difficult to read. The man shuffled ahead, leading me down a narrow corridor. I noticed the door at the end of the hallway was slightly ajar, revealing a dark room. The man paused in front of it, then turned back to me. "I live alone," he said, his voice almost a whisper now. "I used to have company, but they don't visit anymore." The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. There was something about the way he spoke, the way his eyes flicked toward the dark room, that made my heart race. The silence between us stretched on for too long, thick and suffocating. "I think I should go," I said, stepping back toward the door. But the man was faster. He moved with an unexpected swiftness, blocking the doorway with his arm. His face was inches from mine now, his breath hot and heavy. "Stay," he said, his voice suddenly urgent, desperate. "Just for a moment. I need you to stay." I tried to pull away, but something about his grip, something in the air itself, made me feel as though I couldn't move. I had delivered pizzas countless times, but this felt wrong. The man's gaze never left mine. "There's something you need to see. You've already heard it, haven't you? The sound of them." The words barely registered in my mind. My heart pounded in my chest, a frantic beat that matched the increasing tension in the room. I could hear something, too. Something faint, like whispers, just beyond the threshold of hearing. Too soft to make out, but impossible to ignore. He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a near inaudible whisper. "You'll hear them again. It's too late to leave now." The room seemed to darken, and the whispers grew louder, more distinct. They were coming from the shadows of the room at the end of the hall, pulling at me, calling to me in a way I couldn't explain. It was as though the very walls were alive, vibrating with the sound of something, or someone, hidden just out of sight. The man stepped aside, motioning toward the room. "Go ahead, take a look. They've been waiting for you." I didn't want to. I really didn't want to. But my feet moved of their own accord, drawn toward the room, as though an invisible force was guiding me. The whispers grew louder still, and I felt a cold shiver crawl up my spine. I reached the door, the air inside heavy and oppressive. With one final glance at the man, who now stood silent, his eyes locked on me with an intensity I couldn't quite bear, I stepped into the room. And then everything went black. I don't know how long I was unconscious. The darkness enveloped me like a heavy, suffocating blanket, and I couldn't tell if I was still in the man's house or if I had somehow crossed into another place entirely. When I finally came to, I was lying on the cold, hard floor, the smell of must and dampness thick in the air. My head throbbed, my mind a tangled mess of confusion and fear. For a moment, I wondered if I had imagined the whole thing, the strange man, the whispers, the dark room. But as my eyes adjusted to the dim light filtering through a small cracked window, I realized that I was no longer in the hallway. The room around me was unfamiliar, and yet I couldn't shake the feeling that it was all too familiar. The walls were lined with shelves, filled with what looked like old tattered books and strange trinkets. At the far end of the room was a door, slightly ajar, leading to another shadowed space beyond. I pushed myself up, my hands trembling as I steadied myself. My body felt heavy, like I was carrying a weight I couldn't explain. Every part of me screamed to run, to escape, but something held me in place, an invisible force perhaps, or the sheer dread of what I might find if I moved too quickly. I stumbled toward the door, my steps unsteady. The whispers from before had stopped, replaced by a strange, unsettling silence. But as I reached for the doorknob, I felt a cold gust of air sweep through the room, carrying with it the faintest trace of a voice I knew all too well. Help me, I froze. The voice was faint, barely a whisper, but it was unmistakable. It was the voice of a child. My heart raced, and a cold sweat broke out on my skin. The sound of it sent a shiver down my spine, but it wasn't just the voice itself that terrified me. It was the realization that I knew that voice. It belonged to someone I had delivered to before, a little girl no older than 7 or 8, with dark hair and wide, frightened eyes. I pushed the door open, the hinges creaking in protest, and stepped into the next room. What I saw made my stomach drop. The room was dark, but I could make out the faint outline of someone standing in the center. The figure was tall, thin, and unnaturally still. It looked like a person, but there was something wrong about it, something distorted and unnatural. The longer I looked, the more I could see its features shifting, warping, like the figure was made of shadows that refused to stay in one place. And then I saw her. The little girl standing in front of the figure, her eyes wide and glassy, staring at me with an emptiness that sent a wave of panic through my chest. She didn't move. She didn't speak. She simply stood there, her small form trembling slightly in the dim light. The air around me grew colder, and I felt an overwhelming sense of dread fill the room. The figure, which had been motionless until now, began to shift, its long, twisted limbs extending toward me. I tried to back away, but my feet wouldn't move. I was paralyzed, trapped in the gaze of the little girl and the dark, shifting figure behind her. "Please." The girl's voice was barely a breath, but it was clear now, the desperation in her words unmistakable. "Help me." I tried to speak, to say something, but my throat was dry, my voice lost in the oppressive silence. My heart was pounding in my chest, the fear almost suffocating. I had to get out of there. I had to leave. But the figure's shadowy form was closing in on me, its movements jerky and unnatural. Its hands, elongated and thin, reached out, and I could hear the faintest sound of nails scraping against the floor as it dragged itself closer. I finally managed to move, stumbling backward toward the door. My hands fumbled for the handle, but before I could grasp it, the little girl's voice pierced the air again, louder this time. "Please, don't leave me." I spun around, my heart racing as I saw the figure, now almost upon me. Its face, if it could even be called that, was a twisted mass of darkness, with hollow, empty eyes and a mouth that stretched too wide, revealing rows of jagged teeth. It was a face of pure terror, something that shouldn't exist in this world. And then, in that moment, I understood. The whispers, the strange man, the house, it was all connected. The little girl, the figure, and the feeling of being watched. I wasn't just a delivery boy. I was part of something much bigger, something that had been waiting for me to hear the whispers, waiting for me to come closer. I yanked the door open and bolted into the hallway, my heart racing in my chest. But as I ran, the whispers returned, louder than ever. The house seemed to stretch and twist around me, the walls closing in, the floors creaking beneath my feet. I could hear the figure behind me now, its dragging steps echoing through the house, growing louder with every passing second. I didn't dare look back. I couldn't. The only thing that mattered was getting out of there, away from the house, away from the thing that was chasing me. And then, as I reached the front door, I felt a cold, clammy hand on my shoulder, pulling me back into the darkness. I gasped as the cold, clammy hand gripped my shoulder, its touch like ice sinking into my skin. I spun around, my heart racing, my breath coming in shallow, panicked gasps. But there was nothing there, nothing visible at least. The hand was gone, yet the pressure lingered, as if the darkness itself was holding me in place. My eyes darted to the front door. It was still there, just a few feet away, but it might as well have been miles. Every step I took felt like it took me further from escape and deeper into the nightmare. The air grew heavier, thick with an oppressive weight that made it hard to breathe, to think, to move. The whispers were back, louder now, more frantic, filling my head with an overwhelming sense of dread. Agitated, my face contracted into a feature of concentration. I raised my arms, palmed my head, made a fistfight symbol on the desk, and pressed concentration. They weren't just words anymore. They were emotions, raw and desperate, clawing at my mind. You can't leave. You can't escape. I staggered toward the door, my hands shaking as I reached for the handle. My fingers barely brushed the cold metal when I heard it. A low, guttural growl, deep and resonant, like the sound of something ancient and hungry. I froze. The growl came again, this time closer. Closer than I could have imagined. My blood ran cold. The floor beneath my feet seemed to pulse, as if the house itself was alive, breathing, moving with a life of its own. And then I saw it. From the shadows, a figure emerged, its silhouette twisted and distorted, a hulking shape that seemed to stretch and writhe like a living nightmare. It wasn't just one figure now. There were several tall, shadowy forms that flickered in and out of existence, like they were made of smoke, constantly shifting. The darkness seemed to coil around them, making them hard to focus on, like they were never fully there. But one thing was clear: they were coming for me. The whispers grew louder, now mixed with a chorus of growls and guttural sounds that sent a chill down my spine. My body screamed for me to move, but I couldn't. I was rooted to the spot, unable to tear my eyes away from the figures advancing toward me. You shouldn't have come here. The voice was deep, echoing in the very air around me, as though the house itself was speaking. My pulse raced, my throat tight with fear. I couldn't make sense of the words, but I knew one thing. They were true. I shouldn't have come. I shouldn't have answered that call, but now there was no turning back. I tried to push through the panic, to move, to do something, but my legs refused to cooperate. My body was betraying me. Every instinct told me to run, but my mind was too clouded, too overwhelmed by the fear that gripped me. I wanted to scream, to shout, to demand answers, but the words stuck in my throat, as though the very air was thick with terror, suffocating me. One of the figures moved closer, its form flickering like a flame in the wind. It was taller than the others, its body thin and elongated, with arms that stretched too long and fingers that looked like they could reach into my very soul. It came closer, closer still, until I could feel the chill emanating from it, the icy breath that seemed to come from its very being. "Help me," the voice came again, but it wasn't the little girl's voice this time. It was the voice of the thing, the shadow that had been following me. It was pleading, desperate, but there was something twisted in it, something dark and hungry. The figure reached out a hand, its fingers impossibly long, curling toward me like claws. I stumbled backward, my feet finally responding to the primal instinct to escape, but as I turned to run, I heard a loud crash behind me. I didn't look back, but I knew. Something had broken, something important. The house was shifting again, the walls closing in, the space around me narrowing. The front door was still in sight, but now it felt like it was moving further away, retreating into the shadows, just out of reach. I ran faster, my legs aching, my chest burning, but the whispers followed me, like a constant, relentless tide. They filled my ears, my mind, drowning out everything else. "You can't run from us. You can't escape the house." The growl came again, louder this time. A terrible, monstrous sound that seemed to shake the very foundation of the house. My heart hammered in my chest, each beat like a drum urging me to keep moving. I couldn't stop now. I couldn't let them catch me. And then I saw it, the staircase. The stairs led upward, disappearing into a darkness so thick it was like a void, an abyss. But it was my only chance. The door was blocked. The hallway behind me was full of shadows. The stairs were the only way left. I didn't hesitate. I sprinted toward the stairs, my feet pounding against the wooden floor, the growls and whispers growing louder with every step. I reached the bottom of the stairs and grabbed the railing, pulling myself up as quickly as I could. The house seemed to groan around me, the air growing colder with every step I took. The stairs creaked under my weight, as though they were protesting my presence, as though they were warning me to turn back. But I didn't listen. I couldn't. There was no going back now. As I reached the top of the stairs, I looked down at the hallway that stretched before me, a narrow, dimly lit path that seemed to go on forever. I didn't know what awaited me at the end of that hallway, but I knew one thing for sure. I had to keep moving. The darkness behind me was closing in, and there was no time to waste. I took a deep breath, my heart still pounding, and stepped into the hallway, the shadows swallowing me whole. The hallway stretched before me, an endless, twisting path that seemed to distort with every step I took. The dim light from the flickering bulb above barely illuminated the walls, which were cracked and peeling, as if the house itself was decaying from the inside out. The air felt heavier here, thick with a strange, musty scent that clung to my skin and made it hard to breathe. Every breath was like inhaling dust, and the weight of the place seemed to press down on me, pushing me forward with a force I couldn't explain. I glanced over my shoulder, but the staircase was gone. There was no turning back now. The whispers were still there, echoing in my ears, their voices growing louder, more frantic. It was as if the house was alive, and it was trying to communicate with me in some dark, twisted way. "You can't leave, you're already one of us." The voice was low, raspy, and familiar. Too familiar. It sounded like the little girl, the one who had been waiting for me. The realization hit me like a slap to the face. She wasn't just a victim of this house. She was part of it. She was one of them. I swallowed hard, my throat dry, and forced myself to keep moving. The hallway seemed to stretch endlessly before me, twisting and turning in ways that made it impossible to know which direction I was heading. The walls seemed to close in with each step, the darkness pressing against me from all sides. It was as if the house itself was watching, waiting, its very structure alive with malevolent intent. "Don't run." The voice was close now, so close that I could feel the breath of it against my skin. I spun around, but there was nothing there, nothing but the shadows. My heart pounded in my chest, and I took a step back, the floor creaking under my weight. I wasn't alone. I never had been. Suddenly, the floor beneath me shifted. A low rumble filled the air, and the walls groaned as if the house was waking up, stretching its limbs. The ceiling above cracked, sending dust and debris falling around me. I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over my own feet. The house was alive, and it was angry. I needed to get to the window, but I was confined by the floor, and I was not angry with myself. I had to keep moving. I couldn't let it catch me. I turned back toward the hallway and ran. The whispers followed me, louder now, a chorus of voices that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Each step I took seemed to lead me deeper into the house's labyrinthine core, as if it was shifting around me, drawing me in, trapping me in its twisted maze. The thing is, it's still... I reached the end of the hallway and found another door. It was old, its wood warped and splintered, the paint chipped and peeling. There was no handle, no lock, just a gap between the door and the frame, as though it had been forced open long ago and never closed again. Without thinking, I shoved my shoulder into the door. It groaned in protest but gave way with a creak that echoed through the silence. I stumbled into the room beyond, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The room was dark, colder than the hallway, and the air was thick with a heavy, suffocating feeling. I couldn't see anything at first, but then my eyes adjusted and I saw it. Amit reached for my hand and brought it to his lips. Honor hucked. The room was filled with mirrors. Dozens of them. Hundreds, maybe. They lined the walls, some cracked, some pristine, all reflecting the darkness around me. The reflections were warped, distorted, as though they were trying to show me something else. Something that wasn't quite right. I could see myself in the mirrors, but it wasn't just me. In each reflection there were figures lurking in the background, shadows that didn't belong, eyes watching from the corners, faces twisted in agony. I felt my stomach turn, a wave of nausea crashing over me. I stepped back, but the room seemed to close in around me, the mirrors pressing closer, their reflections warping and shifting with each movement. The whispers grew louder, filling the room with a maddening cacophony. They were no longer just voices, they were feelings, emotions dark and overwhelming, pushing against my mind, pulling at my thoughts. You belong here. You've always belonged here. The words weren't just spoken, they were inside me, inside my very thoughts. I staggered back, my hands reaching for something to steady myself, but as my hand touched the wall I felt it, the coldness, the slickness of the surface. It wasn't just the walls, it was the mirrors themselves, their glass freezing to the touch, sending a shock through my fingers. I jerked my hand away, but the reflection in the mirror wasn't mine anymore. It was someone else's. A figure, hunched and cloaked in shadows, stood in the reflection. Its face was hidden, obscured by the darkness, but its eyes were glowing, burning with an unnatural light. I froze, my blood running cold as the figure reached out, its hand pressed against the mirror, as though it was trying to reach through to me. Help me. The voice was soft, but it was filled with such desperation, such anguish, that it tore through me. The figure in the mirror was the little girl, but she was no longer just a victim. She was trapped, her eyes wide with terror, pleading for release. I couldn't help her, not like this, not in this place. But as I turned to leave, I felt a cold hand grip my wrist, pulling me back toward the mirror. The grip on my wrist tightened, a cold, unyielding force pulling me back toward the mirror. Panic surged through me, my breath quick and shallow, but no matter how hard I struggled, I couldn't break free. The mirror seemed to pull at me, its surface rippling like water, distorting the world around me. The figure of the little girl, her face twisted in terror, stared back at me, her eyes pleading. "Please help me," she whispered again, her voice a haunting echo that seemed to reverberate through the very air. I felt the coldness of the glass press against my skin, its icy touch seeping into my bones. My heart raced, and I fought harder, trying to tear myself away, but it was as if the mirror had become part of me, pulling me deeper into its depths. The darkness in the reflection seemed to grow, swallowing everything around me, until there was nothing left but the void. Then, just as I thought I would be consumed by it, a flash of light pierced the darkness. A crack appeared in the mirror, a thin line of brightness cutting through the shadows. The figure of the little girl recoiled, her form flickering like a candle flame in the wind. "You're not like them," she said, her voice softer now, filled with sorrow. "You're different. You don't belong here." The light from the crack in the mirror grew brighter, expanding until it was a blinding beam. The figure in the reflection screamed, its form twisting and distorting, as if the light was tearing it apart. The mirror began to crack further, its surface shattering like glass, and I felt the grip on my wrist loosen. I pulled away with all my strength, stumbling backward as the room around me started to unravel. I was falling through the shattered mirror, through the darkness, until I hit the floor. I gasped, my body jolting as I landed hard on the cold ground. My heart pounded in my chest, and I sat up quickly, looking around. The room was gone, the hallway was gone, the house. Everything was gone. I was outside, standing on the sidewalk in front of the pizza place, the neon sign flickering dimly above me. It was quiet. Too quiet. I looked down at my hands. They were shaking, but they were real, warm, solid. I touched my face, feeling the familiar contours of my skin, and I realized that I was free. The nightmare was over. But then I heard it. The soft, haunting sound of a bell. I turned toward the sound, and there it was. A delivery boy, standing at the corner of the street. His figure was blurred, as if I couldn't quite focus on him, and he was holding a pizza box in his hands. The same pizza box that had started this whole nightmare. I took a step forward, but before I could approach him, he vanished. Just like that. One moment he was there, and the next, nothing. The bell rang again, and I spun around, but there was no one there. Only the empty street, the silent buildings, and the distant sound of traffic. I felt a chill run down my spine, a shiver of recognition. It wasn't over. The house, the nightmare. It was still there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the next delivery. But I wasn't the one it was waiting for anymore. I took a deep breath, letting the cold night air fill my lungs. I had escaped, but the question lingered in my mind, unanswered and unsettling. I asked how many others had fallen into its grasp before me, how many others would fall after. I looked at the pizza box in my hands. The lid was slightly ajar, as if someone, or something, had opened it, and I couldn't help but wonder, was there something still inside? The end.